It's a career that both implicitly and explicitly has raised a number of important questions about how to bridge the gap between theory and practice. That is, between philosophy and human experience in the broadest sense, and perhaps especially between political philosophy and the sometimes unruly reality of social and political life. My remarks today are going to explore one of the most vexing of these questions, the question of how to promote stability in multicultural democracies and what, if anything, philosophy might contribute to this project. Now, the question of political stability in the broadest sense is as old as political philosophy itself. We know this from Plato's proposal in the Republic to protect the ideal polity by means of an elaborate myth, the noble lie. We know this because Aristotle cared enough about the practical stability of political societies to give advice to the statesman to prefer a mixed constitution. But the multicultural society, which I follow Taylor in understanding as a society in which there are many cultures, all of which want to survive, he says this in the Politics of Recognition. These many cultures who all want to survive pose the problem of stability in a very special way. So the question is, how can complex democracies characterized by a profound diversity of doctrines, cultures, and ethnicities minimize destructive social conflict and preserve social institutions that promote common purposes? Now, John Rawls famously argued that the stability of a democracy depends upon its success in achieving an overlapping consensus on principles of justice to govern its basic structure. The principles must constitute a political conception, he says, that draws on central features of democratic political culture without presupposing any particular comprehensive doctrine about broader questions of values and virtues. Rawls offered this political liberalism as a way for philosophy to be practical as well as political, responding to the fact of reasonable pluralism with a conception that might be endorsed by all reasonable comprehensive doctrines that exist in a democracy regulated by it. And Rawls also believed that a democracy is stable for the right reasons, he uses that phrase, only when it's characterized by overlapping consensus on such a conception. Yet even sympathetic critics like Kurt Beyer and the political theorist George Klosko have challenged the political sociology that underwrites Rawls's account, and they've questioned his assumption that democracies are stable in the right way only when grounded in agreement on substantive principles. Now, Taylor does not explicitly claim to be addressing the problem of the stability of democracies, but in the essay Nationalism and Modernity, and then in Modern Social Imaginaries, he offers compelling reasons to think that Rawls's critics are right. The basis of democratic stability, Taylor suggests, is not a question of philosophy, but of the social imaginary. We need to ask, and I quote, "What is the feature of our imagined communities by which people very often accept that they are free under a democratic regime, even when their will is overridden on important issues?" End quote. Now, what's central to the democratic social imaginary, Taylor continues, is a political identity involving the idea of membership in an ongoing collective agency, through which each member realizes freedom, whether or not any particular exercise of sovereignty produces an outcome with which every member agrees. Taylor's rich analysis of the modern social imaginary builds on Benedict Anderson's view that, like any community larger than a village allowing face-to-face contact, a nation is an imagined community. According to Taylor, the social imaginary, and I quote, "is that common understanding that makes possible common practices and a widely shared sense of legitimacy," end quote. But for all of its richness, Taylor's account of the political identity that defines the democratic social imaginary may be incomplete. He contends that in democracies, the people must be understood as essentially a collective unit of decision and deliberation. Yet, as Anderson urges, Even when a nation is composed of 1 billion people, it is still a community, and as such, must involve a deep horizontal comradeship, a fraternity. Anderson finds evidence of how strong this fraternity can be in the willingness of citizens to die for their countries. Taylor recognizes that the strength of democratic fraternity is equally evident in the willingness to suppress political resentments, even when we lose out in the electoral process. But how should we understand democratic fraternity and the political identity bound up with it? In my view, the deeper political identity at stake, both in the willingness to suppress resentment and to make profound sacrifice, cannot be exhausted by the idea of membership in a common agency. I claim that democratic fraternity also involves the idea of membership in a community of memory in secular time that persists through time, a community that claims a history, but that can also revise its understanding of that history and even remake itself in light of that revision. So this raises a broader question about the sources of democratic fraternity. And here, the shortcomings of most liberal political thought are especially pronounced. So either you're Mill and you argue that cultural homogeneity is the only key to political stability, or like other liberal social theorists, you try to understand social cooperation in terms of agreement on fair terms of cooperation. But I'm going to argue that stable political life demands civic virtues that cannot be understood in such terms. Equally important, it's not clear that these virtues can be understood solely or even primarily in terms of Taylor's notion of identification with an imagined unit of deliberation and decision-making. The democratic social imagination always includes the idea, I claim, of membership in a community of memory. The people in a democracy must also be understood as a collective subject of experience over time, with a capacity to claim and reshape a history and to create a future that reflects that reshaping. And a community can survive over time only if we can count on others to act in ways that preserve it. This leads to the idea, then, that democratic fraternity includes important civic virtues. Now, in these remarks, I will discuss three civic virtues that are crucial to democratic fraternity and offer a few brief observations about how they're connected to the idea of membership in a community of memory. First, I'll argue that democratic fraternity involves a framework of civic trust. Here I'll echo some of the concerns that Daniel Weinstock has argued in the late 90s. And that trust has got to survive the inability to predict all the situations in which we need to trust and the consequent limits on knowledge about who might be appropriate objects of trust. Second, democratic fraternity embodies a readiness to make civic sacrifices in service of common goals. This is Anderson's notion. But it's got to survive our inability to interact directly with those who may be called on to sacrifice for us or who will presume our readiness to sacrifice for them. Third, building on Taylor's important suggestion, I'll argue that democratic fraternity involves a willingness to extend the civic equivalent of grace. Grace to people whose interests and commitments will sometimes trump ours in democratic decision-making. Now, to be sure, democratic fraternity involves additional virtues that I can't discuss here. It may also depend on what Kurt Beyer has called a constitutional consensus, a kind of agreement on the process for adjudication when interests conflict. But in these remarks, I focus on civic trust, civic sacrifice, and civic grace as central components of the political culture that makes democracy possible, and as indispensable elements of the collective self-understanding that promotes political stability. Now, to understand civic trust, some theorists, particularly in mainstream liberal political thought, might turn to the idea of agreement on fair terms of cooperation. As Annette Beyer has noted, contractual agreements have a certain functional excellence in our analysis of trust. An agreement allows us to make clear what we count on another to do, what happens when the expectations aren't met, and what consequences follow when they are not. Contractual agreements thus offer a trusting party a fair degree of security, significantly minimizing risk and vulnerability that attend any readiness to trust. But Beyer also urges that a great deal of social life involves interactions quite unlike those in which contractual agreement can minimize risk and vulnerability. These are interactions that dramatically limit our ability to form precise expectations and constrain our capacity to know precisely who is to meet them. Beyer also adds, and I think quite rightly, that social life also involves many interactions in which we are connected to others in relationships of shifting and varying power asymmetry that increase our vulnerability and enhance the risks of interaction even further. And my view is that some of these interactions raise problems of social cooperation and solidarity that have profound implications for the stability of complex democracies. Consider, for instance, the unexpected risks and the asymmetries in power and knowledge that in post-9/11 America may affect daily interactions between Muslim Americans, especially if they're observant, and non-Muslim Americans. What transpires as part of the complex networks of trust and trustworthiness at stake in such interactions can have political ramifications that transcend the local outcome of any particular interaction. Imagine a fire emergency in which members of a Muslim community in New York City must trust in the professionalism and goodwill of firefighters living with the complex legacy, psychosocial legacy, of the World Trade Center collapse. What makes it likely that in such situations, some agents will accept their vulnerabilities and take on the risks of trust, and then others will meet the demanding expectations of those who trust them? That is, what processes and practices create and sustain civic trust in a complex democracy? Now, a theorist of social capital, like a Robert Putnam or a Francis Fukuyama in his recent incarnations, might insist that the informal norms that promote the right kind of cooperation arise from participation in voluntary associations. But as theorists of multiculturalism have recognized, the kind of fraternity that emerges in such associations and groups can be turned against ethnic, cultural, and national minorities when they are perceived as outsiders. So what's the solution? Well, theorists of multicultural accommodation have urged that reform in education and history is one vehicle, not only for meeting reasonable demands for minority group recognition, but broadening the self-understandings of every citizen to extend networks of cooperation and solidarity. But education, formal education in history, isn't the only means of extending these networks. It's not the only means of reshaping the way democratic citizens think about the communities of memory to which they envision themselves belonging. For instance, when we participate in debates about the proper focal points for a society's collective memory, perhaps especially public projects of remembrance, we're engaged in debates that respond to emotional and cognitive needs and interests that formal history cannot address. Public projects of remembrance, monuments, memorials, may become embodiments of shared values, objects of collective pride, reminders of shared grief, or promises of hope for a society's future. This indeed is why, even at the start of the 21st century, so many societies continue to create monuments and memorials despite the efforts of influential critics to show that they're obsolete or anti-democratic. Now, one means of establishing and affirming a group's place in a community of memory is to take an active part in debates about such projects. Indeed, I believe that political societies must create the conditions in which such debates can be constructively carried out. And remember, these are not just about the proper understanding of a national past, but about what a nation can become in a future that embodies the best of those democratic traditions. Such debates reflect and draw upon the dialogical character of human experience that Taylor has so convincingly described. They're never easy. The recent controversy surrounding a plan to build an Islamic community center a few blocks from the former World Trade Center site, provides important evidence of that fact. But the discussions about that plan effectively foregrounded the real choice at stake in the claim that this was somehow insensitive or an insult to those who were the victims of 9/11. What was really at stake was a choice between preserving America's traditions of religious freedom or sacrificing those traditions to the misrepresentations, prejudice, and mistrust that led to the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. Now, I want to talk about the debates as a kind of politics, but I call it a politics of memory. And I want to insist that the politics of memory is quite different from the politics of equal recognition. The politics of equal recognition is largely a politics of difference, has the tendency or the potential in its extreme to encourage separation. The politics of memory is a politics of solidarity. It asks, who are we? What do we stand for? What do we have rather to hope for? And what might we have to be sorry for or to apologize about in what we have done as a nation? I suggest that Taylor's notion of the fusion of horizons, Taylor's appeal to Gadamer's notion, rather, of the fusion of horizons, this phenomenon through which what we have formerly taken for granted as the background evaluation can be situated as one possibility along a different background of the formerly unfamiliar culture. This kind of fusion of horizons is actually most possible when we have these debates about collective memory. The theorist Gregory Hoskins has argued that the processes that make a fusion of horizons possible are bound up with some of the requirements we have to meet in order to debate a difficult memory. In particular, the demand that we have to suspend our suspicion of the other long enough to actually engage in debate. And in fact, I can say more about this later, but I think the debate in an imperfect way about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the debate surrounding Maya Lin, the architect's design, was just such a debate that helped in a really important way to reestablish democratic fraternity in a society that remained deeply divided by doctrinal differences over the justice of the war itself. Now, reflecting on the Vietnam Memorial reminds us that suffering and loss in war are central to projects of public remembrance and provides a natural transition to the topic of civic sacrifice. Anderson rightly emphasizes the colossal sacrifices of life and well-being that people have been willing to make on behalf of nations. But we know that civic sacrifice isn't exhausted by life and battle. Indeed, a readiness to sacrifice on behalf of others is central to democratic cooperation. If citizens of democracies couldn't count on others to make such sacrifices, much of what's fundamental to democratic life would be impossible. Yet the sacrifice embodied in death and loss in war is clearly an important element of the solidarity that characterizes imagined communities. And think of the extraordinary opportunities the commemoration of such loss provides for the politics of memory that amounts to nation building. I'll give just the example of Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, rethinking the idea of we the people and what they were committed to. Anderson emphasizes cultural significance of tombs of unknown soldiers, monuments that are either deliberately empty or contain unidentified remains. He says they're saturated with ghostly national imaginings. I think if we look more closely, perhaps especially beginning from World War I, it turns out that national imaginings of sacrifice and loss are increasingly focused on naming the lost whenever possible. And this is why a particularly interesting example from the case of Boston in the late 20th century, in which a group of African Americans fought to have the recoverable names of black soldiers who fought in a famous battle in Charleston for the Confederacy's port in Charleston, South Carolina. It's commemorated in the statue that's featured in the movie Glory. They fought to have the names of the black soldiers actually included on that statue. And I want to argue that their efforts were, whatever we think about the question of historical accuracy, that the resolution of their controversy, of getting the names printed on the base of the memorial, were a profound expression of just the kind of sort of democratic fraternity that this politics of memory can involve. Taylor rightly argues that there is an inner link between democracy and strong common agency that follows the logic of the legitimacy principle that underlies democratic regimes. But if we hope to understand the sources of stability in multicultural democracies, we must also acknowledge that there are powerful links between political identity and collective memory, and recognize the importance of the dialogical processes through which groups can seek to have their sacrifices recognized and honored. But I claimed at the outset that civic sacrifice isn't the only evidence of the depth of the fraternity that characterizes stable democracies. So I conclude with a few observations about a notion that I have come to call civic grace. Here I'm adopting an idea from a moral philosopher named Jeffrey Scar, who's written about something he calls political grace. Civic grace, in my view, is what underlies the willingness to relinquish political resentments in service of common ideals and goals. Civic grace is different from political forgiveness, which starts from an assumption of blameworthy wrongdoing and typically requires individual face-to-face interactions with the object of forgiveness. Civic grace is an extension of goodwill to political opponents one may never meet, a willingness to treat them with civility and to assume that disagreement does not have to be equivalent to disrespect. And democracies depend upon widespread possession of civic grace. This is why the steep decline of civic grace in America and the associated rise in the politics of resentment are posing a profound challenge to the stability of American democracy. Yet civic grace emerges at unexpected moments, as it recently did in the American debate about health insurance and access to contraception. Responding to vitriolic attacks on a Georgetown University law student who took a public stand in that debate, Georgetown's president insisted that whether or not Americans agreed with the student's stance, they must recognize that she was acting, and I quote, in the tradition of the deepest values that Americans share as a people. That was his phrase. He even enlisted his religious beliefs in support, in her defense, citing St. Augustine's disdain for arrogance in debate. He argued that protecting space for constructive civil discourse is a way for Americans to respect a sacred trust handed down across the generations. Civic grace thus allowed him to serve as something of a moral exemplar, framing a vexing controversy in terms of shared commitment to an important element of America's collective national memory. Of course, civic grace cannot suppress the underlying disagreements about the moral dimensions of sexuality, the nature of the family, and the role of women in society that underlie the debate about contraception. Those disagreements reflect the deep diversity that democratic fraternity must acknowledge and respect, even as it affirms this deep social solidarity. Taylor's notion of the modern social imaginary has greatly enriched our understanding of how that delicate balance might be struck. But civic trust, civic sacrifice, and civic grace are virtues that matter because they connect us to complex and constantly evolving communities of memory. Thank you.